Hey there, Kindred Spirits. You are listening to another fabulous episode of Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. With me today is my co-host, Reagan Duffy.
Hello, kindred spirits.
And today we are joined by a third grown lady, our very special guest, Dr. Andrea Mackenzie.
Delighted to join you today.
We are so excited that you are here.
So we would love to introduce you to Andrea Mackenzie, who is an associate professor at York University in Toronto, Canada. With Benjamin Lefebvre, she co-edited the restored text of Rilla of Ingleside, an essential read, by the way, for all of you following along for this season. And with Jane Ledwell, she co-edited the essay collection Ella Montgomery and War. So you can see why she had to join us. Andrea was also visiting scholar with the Ella Montgomery Institute, and she co-chaired 2 of the biennial conferences, besides contributing multiple chapters and articles about Montgomery's work over the years. With Benjamin Lefebvre, she co-founded the award-winning Ella Montgomery Readathon during the first weeks of the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020. Andrea's other research specialty is Canadian nurses' experiences overseas during the First World War. She has even published a book of nurses' letters entitled War-Torn Exchanges, and she regularly publishes articles and gives talks about nurses' wartime experiences. When it comes to life on the Canadian home front during World War I, and especially where that intersects with Ella Montgomery, Andrea is the expert. We are so privileged to be able to bring her insight and expertise to all of you as we discuss what it was like for women and girls in Canada during World War I. Today's episode is all about the girls of Glen St. Mary, what they were doing during the war, how they were serving and assisting the war effort, and what options were even available to them.
But before we get started, a quick reminder, if you are not already hanging out with us on Instagram, come join us at kindredspirits.bookclub. That's where we share updates, giveaways, cozy bookish memes, glimpses of our ever-growing Ella Montgomery libraries. We also love chatting with listeners in the DMs and in the comments. It feels like an extension of the book club. A 5-star rating for the podcast is like pulling up another chair so more book club members can join us. It helps kindred spirits find us. So if you have been enjoying this podcast, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen. If you would also like to support the podcast, you can shop our bookshop.org link. You'll find it in our show notes to find all the books that we recommend in our pods and some of our favorite editions of the Ella Montgomery books. You'll be helping to support the pod when you do that. You'll also be supporting indie booksellers too. So win, win, win. Now, let's get into the fun stuff. Andrea, we love to start episodes with our guests by asking them how they first came to Anne of Green Gables or Ella Montgomery more generally.
Well, I grew up in rural Ontario in a tiny village of 500 people, and I used the public library a lot. But I have to say it was not love at first read for Ella Montgomery. The number of books in the library was understandably limited, so there was Anne of Green Gables on the shelf when I was looking for a new read. It took me 3 visits and 3 attempts before I finally took the book out and read it through. And of course, once I was hooked, I went on a search for other Montgomery books, found some on my parents' shelf, found more in the library, and just kept on hunting until I found them all.
Oh, I love that. But it makes sense, I think, a lot of people when they first encounter Anne of Green Gables, sometimes it just doesn't hit you right away, whether it's your age or the space that you're in or just getting through that first chapter. So I'm glad that you stuck with it because here you are.
Yes, absolutely. I have to say those 3 visits were within 3 weeks. So
Okay, so it
once a
didn't take
week.
you too long.
Yeah, so I had to get past Mrs. Lind. She was not my favorite character, but once I was past her and at the train station with Matthew and with Anne, I was off and reading.
Yeah, weren't we all? So do you have a favorite Ella Montgomery book or maybe even a least favorite? If you can choose.
My standard response to that is whichever book I'm currently reading is my favorite book. I have to say, though, that Rilla of Ingleside really is overall. It has a slight edge over the other books. But once I start to think about Montgomery's works, I think, yeah, Rilla is one of my favorites, but so is Emily And then I love the Blue Castle. I could go on and on and on.
Yeah, I think it's often hard for a lot of people to, especially I think if you're a scholar, because once you spend so much deep time with some of these books, even ones that you didn't initially think you maybe loved as much, I think then you discover a whole new level to them, a whole new understanding, and just choosing seems kind of unfair.
Exactly.
But we always ask it anyway, because sometimes we unearth some hot takes, which we love.
And speaking of hot takes, do you have a least favorite Montgomery text?
That's a really difficult question because there's something interesting to like in every single one of her works.
Yeah.
I would have to say that Mistress Pat would not be on my favorites list. And I think the reason for that is because to me it's a very dark book. Pat
Mm.
seems very confined and trapped right up until the end. But there are still details in it and hilarious scenes like that. I think it was Christmas dinner where everything goes wrong for her, and yet the meal still gets eaten, and she has a new niece as a result.
Yeah.
We've really had the experience of going through these books in such a detailed way for our podcast, where a lot of times we will take a text that we struggle with on first read, or that even we've heard from others is not their favorite, and we really come away with exactly what you're talking about, Andrea. You still have that scene or that collection of scenes, or maybe even that character where you're like, okay, the rest of this book is not for me, but I'm still so glad that we got to experience this moment. I'm thinking about our deep dive into Kilmeny of the Orchard, Reagan.
What happened there?
We both, I think I had read it like once when I was maybe a teen, and then Kelly had never read it. And we decided to kind of throw it in at the end of a season. And we spent the entire book being like, what is happening?
I think we ended up appreciating it for its outlandishness.
Right?
Yes,
It
yes,
just seems
definitely.
so very different than so many of some of her other books, and just like the wild twists and turns on some of those. Yeah, Kilmeny of the Orchard was, yeah, that was kind of a surprise of a book. I wouldn't necessarily say always in the best way, but certainly in an interesting way.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I found the same thing with the readathon because we went through chapter by chapter and we had readers recording the chapters, and I would then edit them and also check them through to make sure the vocabulary was correct, et cetera, et cetera. But I found it really interesting to do that because I had to listen to and read every word of every chapter.
Hmm.
And once you have read Montgomery so many times, you tend to start skimming to get to your favorite part. So
Mm.
that pulled me back and gave me a real insight into the way that she uses language and narrates events. So it was wonderful. Kilmeny, I never took an in-depth look at, though.
Yeah.
Probably,
Um,
probably for the best.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know whether we'll go back to Kilmeny, right? There's definitely some books where we're like, wow, we might want to come back to this again in a different way, as we're continuing to gather more information and
Mhm.
expertise and appreciation and see how many things connect. Kilmeny's maybe on the lower end of that scale, but we can certainly appreciate it for a stop along Ella Montgomery's growth arc as an author.
Yes, well, it was a shorter serial story that she had already published, and her publisher made her turn it into a book in a very short space of time. So, you know, it reminds me of this film I watched at the art gallery the other day by an artist whose artistic process is quite lengthy because he etches on copper and then does prints from it. He held up his design for his ultimate print. And he said this stage is the most important because if you have a weak design, it will plague you all the way through the process.
Mm.
Well, I think we can probably see that happening with Kilmeny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can see it
Okay.
stretching at its seams, that it was maybe not meant to be expanded. It kind of reminds me a little bit. I love a good fantasy book about how an author will sort of blow up and they'll be pressured to turn what maybe should have been two books into a 5 book series, and you can see the strain happening in the
Mhm.
middle.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, so one of the reasons we really, really wanted to have you on the podcast this season is that during COVID lockdown, you started a very special project, and that started with Rilla of Ingleside. Can you tell us a little bit more about the readathon on Facebook?
Certainly. So I'm sure, as you recollect, that COVID-19 came up very suddenly. One moment we were hopefully happily doing our normal everyday things and works. And the next, we were locked down and isolated. At that particular point in time, the work that was going on, sewing masks, well, I can't sew very well. I don't have the knowledge to do work into vaccines and such. I was feeling as lost as Rilla was at the start of Rilla of Ingleside. I wanted to do something to help, and I didn't seem to have the skills to do it. So I racked my brains and I thought, well, if we're all isolated, we're all stressed, and we're all fearful about what's going to happen. Rilla of Ingleside, one of the strengths of the book is the community that is created through catastrophe. And I thought if we are all socially distanced and isolated, we can still craft community online. So the idea of the readathon came to me. It was called the Rilla of Ingleside Readathon to start with. And I thought of that book because it is about a community dealing with catastrophe. Ella Montgomery called the war like the coming of a sudden storm. I may not have the absolutely accurate words of hers, but it came up like a sudden thunderstorm and changed life completely. Once I had thought up this idea of let's do a readathon about Rilla, I knew I would need help. And so I called up my friend Ben Lefebvre, who is, of course, a good friend, a colleague, and also one of the greatest experts on Montgomery living today, and asked him if he would like to help. He said, certainly. We announced it, I think, on Saturday, Friday or Saturday, to start on Monday in late March. And by the first day, we already had over 200 interested people.
That's amazing.
I
It
love
was.
I love how many people signed up to like audit a class on Rilla of Ingleside with basically no notice. That really speaks to the strength of the Ella Montgomery fan community and kindred spirits around the world. Yeah, I just love that. And I'm really interested in knowing more about what were some of the similarities that you and Ben and the community that you created around Rilla of Ingleside during COVID. What were some of the similarities that you were pulling out from the text that were applying to that contemporary experience?
I think, first of all, the bewilderment that comes in through so strongly, and Montgomery wrote it so well. Bewilderment with a focus on Rilla, but also on the other members of the family and the community, because that's how we felt, I think, at the time, was just bewilderment that this sudden catastrophe had hit us. But it was also, to a large extent, the question of how do we cope? And when we look at the coping mechanisms and strategies in Rilla, they applied very much to us at the time, finding work to do or interests that would help us contain some of the stress, especially remembering we had the same fear as Rilla and her family during the war. And that was people were dying because of COVID, and men were going to be killed. Some women were too, as a result of the war. So there was that sense of fear and stress of what's going to happen to our friends, our family members. We can look at Montgomery's book as how did they do it? What can we learn from this? There were other lighter details that maybe didn't seem so light at the time. Do you recall a shortage of yeast and
Yes,
toilet
because
paper?
everybody decided they were going to bake sourdough bread.
Yes,
Yes, me
exactly.
among them.
How'd that go, Kel?
I was personally impacted by the yeast shortage.
Yes, I was lucky enough to walk into the drugstore rather than the grocery store and find, the cherished package of yeast. But it wasn't just yeast. I remember walking into the grocery store to empty shelves of almost everything.
I remember going in and like we had been looking for toilet paper, and I go
Mhm.
into the grocery store and I see somebody coming past me and they've got like a package of toilet paper, and they're like, there's two left on the shelf. They told me like, go get it right now, go straight there. We're getting like one of the last like packages of toilet paper. We're like, this is a weird thing to run out of.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
I remember buying a bunch of kitchen supplies from restaurants, both because grocery stores were running out and restaurants needed people to support them. And so I remember buying like sacks of rice from a local Thai restaurant.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah. And there were all kinds of things. I do remember going in to look for flour, and the shelves were completely empty of flour, but not only flour, also sugar, salt, all the essentials. And going through three different stores and finding the same thing, and then going to my local drugstore once again and finding flour, salt, sugar.
Your local drugstore is amazing.
So when we think of food rationing in Rilla, we were also circulating recipes given all these food shortages
Hmm.
for people to help try and help people out. There was a lot of interest in the readathon when I got to the food rationing and the recipes that were developed during the war. So that was interesting. That was also a parallel. It was also a case of, although it doesn't show up that much in Rilla of Ingleside, one of the things that I thought at the time was the economic disruption with so many people not able to go into work. Well, the same thing did happen during the First World War. There was disruption of labor at the time. And of course, married men who enlisted, their wives got an allowance, but it was a very small one.
Mm.
And that's where some of the charitable work came in. I have to say, one of the other parallels was the fundraising going on during the pandemic and the fundraising that is wholeheartedly supported by most members of the community in Rilla. So there are all kinds of parallels there. But for me, the readathon was about engagement. And one of the strongest things in the book, and I think why so many people were drawn to it, was the strategies for coping with this life,
Yeah.
our lives, when they have utterly, utterly changed. This has never happened to us before. How do we deal with it? So, yeah, the readathon was about engagement. We had readers recording the chapters and we would put them up 2 or 3 times a week. We had discussion questions. We had all kinds of interesting discussions about all the aspects of the book, really. And then when it was quite ironic, really, because again, it's like the First World War. We planned Rilla of Ingleside for 3 months, and we thought this will all be over at the end of 3 months and life will be back to normal. And it wasn't. So we started another book, and then Ben suggested, I think, for our third book that maybe we should change the title of the group to the Ella Montgomery Readathon. And that's what we did. And we just kept on going because people in various parts of the world were still locked down and still in need of community.
You know, the Ella Montgomery Readathon actually, I don't even know whether Kelly real knows this, was what led me to find the Ella Montgomery Institute, because I was directed to the Facebook group because we didn't start the pod until well after COVID. It was not a COVID project. I mentioned it in one of those culture study book threads. We love culture study as a Substack. And somebody in there had responded and said, oh, well, if you love Ella Montgomery, you should check out the Ella Montgomery Readathon on Facebook. So I did. And that was probably around the time that you had probably posted something about the upcoming conference, the last conference at the Ella
Mhm.
Montgomery Institute. And so then I said that to Kelly, be like, we should think about going to this. And that was kind of what led us into the getting connected with the academic community, was that comment on a random post in a random Substack who's like, you should go check this out. And I went and I was like, wow, the depth of information and knowledge that you guys have collected in there is absolutely incredible. I mean, that's a gold mine of information in there.
Thank
What I'm
you.
hearing is that this podcast today, like what we are doing right now, this conversation would not exist but for the Ella Montgomery Readathon.
Yep.
Really?
I think so because,
Oh,
well, I mean, maybe we would have stumbled across the Ellen Montgomery Institute and the like getting deciding that we could directly connect with the academic community. But if we had missed that first conference, we wouldn't have done that obviously until coming up on this year. So I think there was just like this kind of it happened at the right time that we found that, and that led us to the institute, and I think that led us to taking the podcast in a way that has allowed us to bring in more academic experts. I think it all got very connected there.
I think that's great. I think that's absolutely great. Let me tell you a little secret, by the way. So, I said earlier, my other research work is Canadian nurses' experience overseas during the First World War, which can be quite emotionally draining to study. So, Ella Montgomery is my pleasure. I read her books. I mean, despite being an academic who also studies them, I read her books for sheer pleasure.
Mm.
They are my lighter side of things when the other research gets a little bit too difficult.
I think Ellen Montgomery, at least for both of us, has certainly been kind of an ultimate comfort read throughout our lives. And that's why we started the podcast was we wanted to talk so much about the books that we just love so deeply and have brought us so much joy and comfort over years.
I think that is so great. I mean, what you're doing, creating yet another Montgomery community that's friendly and welcoming and enjoyable. I think it's terrific what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
Andrea? Well, speaking of both Rilla as a comfort read and speaking about Rilla as sort of reflecting what happens kind of when your world gets turned upside down, one of the things, your work on the Ella Montgomery Readathon made me think of, Andrea, was how intensely I connected to Rilla of Ingleside when I was rereading it for this season of the podcast, because it felt so directly relevant to my experiences following the fires in Los Angeles last year. So just to catch anyone up, because by the time this episode comes up, we'll be more than a year past it. But in January 2025, there were two massively destructive fires in Los Angeles caused by just a horrible combination of a dry winter and hurricane force winds. And so I, along with 13,000 other families in Los Angeles, lost my home. And the year after that, of course, was tough for all the reasons that you'd imagine. But what I really noticed in rereading Rilla was how similar our experiences were, like hers with the war and mine with this, post-fire experience. And sometimes in like very subtle ways. Like I really connected to how Rilla talks about time in the book. She refers to life before the war as the dear old cloudless days of a century ago. And that felt so real to me because after you experience a great loss, whether it's something like your life being thrown into upheaval by a war or a lockdown or a loss caused by a death or, anything like this, but you have these moments when your life feels divided in two and your life before that division, before that loss feels simple and cloudless. And it feels like it's a century ago, right? It feels so much longer ago than it actually was. This comes up for me all the time. I'll be like scrolling through my phone and like a memory will pop up like, oh, this day 2 years ago. And it's me in my old house wearing my old clothes with my old things. And none of that exists anymore except for me. And it's impossible to believe that that was only 2 years ago. And it made me really realize that Rilla of Ingleside is, in a lot of ways, about how families and individuals respond to mass trauma and tragedy. When you experience these catastrophic events that affect thousands of people or millions of people in the case of World War I, billions of people in the case of COVID, it's like there are two levels of harm. There's that individual level of harm, right? What you on the individual level are going through, your response. So for me, after the fire, that was the fact that we lost our home and all of our possessions, and we experienced homelessness and displacement anxiety. But then there's also the collective level of harm, right? The collective level of harm you go through as a nation at war, the collective level of harm we all went through during COVID-19, and the harm that we experienced after the fire, right? Our whole community was gone, that whole way of life, schools and parks and farmers markets and coffee shops, everything just like disappeared overnight. So yeah, like Rilla experienced in this book, living through catastrophe and massive tragedy means that on a collective level, life is never going to be the same again. My town is not going to be what it was ever again. It's gone. And we are rebuilding and we're building a new town and it will be wonderful, but it will be different. And then that's the same for individuals, right? We will never be the same again. I won't be the person who I was before the house burned down. I'll always live the rest of my life knowing what it feels like to lose everything so fast. And Rill is the same way, right? She shows us the many, many ways that life in Canada collectively changed during World War I, and also how Rilla herself changed, right? She was never going to be the person that she was before that war. I'm put in mind a little bit of our conversation with Laura Robinson from a few episodes ago, where we were talking about how the war is the making of Rilla.
Yeah, she
She's
would not be the person that she is at the end of the book. If her 4 years had been the way that she had predicted it was going to go, she would be a different person. She would have grown and matured too, but differently.
differently. And
Very
there
much
are these
so.
things that happen in our lives. There are catastrophes and loss and grief that happen to us where we don't go back to the people we used to be. And reading Rilla and seeing that was deeply comforting to me this year. And I understand why that also brought great comfort to all the readers who were along with you for the Ella Montgomery Readathon project in 2020 as well.
Yes. First, may I say how very sorry I am for you losing your home,
Oh, thank you,
having
Andrea. I
to,
mean, yeah, it's awful.
yeah, having to endure that. We do see that in Rilla, that coming to terms with catastrophe. What we also see is the length that they had to endure the prospect of loss. The note of hope, I think, in the book is the formation of community
Mm,
and the willingness of most people to help through Red Cross work, through numerous gestures that show that they are aware of the individual loss at the same time that the community is going through that collective tragedy. So
yeah.
you see that at the time of, for example, Rilla's brother Walter's death, how the family draws together, how one of her colleagues, Betty in the Red Cross, defends Rilla against criticisms made of her by Irene Howard, of the ways that communities reach out to the individual family that is suffering. And
Mm,
yet understanding at the same time, no one who ever experienced the First World War, their lives were not the same. They could not be the same. I have spoken to various women. I ran a workshop about Rilla in 2008 at UPEI for one of the conferences, and I spoke to some of the women. I also spoke to some in 2014 for the conference on Ella Montgomery and War. Women whose families had lost brothers, sons, during the First World War. The family's life was never the same. The men were never, ever forgotten, and the collective experience of war was never forgotten. So when we think back, when we look at Montgomery's writing of the war, she wrote this in 1919 or 1920 for publication in 1921. Even then, you can see that the catastrophe is written in. And as you so aptly put it, Kelly, it is suffering of the individual, but it's also the suffering of the whole, of the entire country, of the community. Yet at the same time, Montgomery also realized that with a 4.5 year war, she could not place emphasis only on the suffering. Laughter still lightens and is a strategy that is always needed. And enjoyment, even when the daily stress seems almost insurmountable.
yeah.
So she layered that in very deftly.
It's one of the things that makes this book such a multifaceted read. It's one of the things that has made this such a rich text for us to mine this season. It's in many ways a very funny book, right? You see them going through their everyday lives and experiencing all sorts of like hilarious little moments, and then, horrible things are happening mere pages later. It reflects our lived experience so well in that way.
Yes, and I have to say, some of my favorite moments in the entire book. I mean, my absolute favorite has to be the shabby boot and gallant shoe moment. And Rilla
Yes.
dresses up to go apologize to Irene to get Irene to sing at the concert. And it's that moment when Rilla looks down and is stunned by the black lisle stocking and shabby boot on one foot and the filmy silk stocking and steel buckled shoe on the other.
She had two different errands in her mind at that moment and just did both of them at once.
And of course, what's funny about it, right, is like in the backdrop of this war, she's still a teenage girl who is meeting with her frenemy and wants to put literally her best foot forward. And she's holding both of these truths in her mind of like, well, the look, this is in the service of this much more important cause, but I still feel humiliated and I still feel ridiculous doing this, and I shouldn't because it's not a big deal. But I always think, even in the midst of big, slow moving tragedies, those small moments where we're very human and we're very much ourselves anyway, like that's what you kind of hold on to. You're still a person in the middle of a tragedy. You still care about the silly things that you care about in the
Yeah.
middle of a tragedy. You don't lose who you are, even if you change. And that's what's so funny about this moment, right?
Yes, I agree.
Well, let's do this. We'll transition into the bulk of our episode. And so we'll do that by talking about our kindred spirit of the episode. We kind of had a tie when we were trying to figure out who was our kindred spirit of the episode. And it's a tie between Faith Meredith and Mary Vance. These two young women represent two very different responses to the war and very different experiences. Faith Meredith is truly Jem's counterpart. I mean, she jumps into action immediately with the Red Cross. She immediately avows that she wishes she were a man so she could enlist to fight too. Mary Vance, on the other hand, doesn't think the war concerns Canadians and is against her beau, Miller Douglas, enlisting, but eventually she becomes a fervent supporter of the war. Faith Meredith spends most of her time off page. First, she's away at Redmond in college and she works with the Red Cross there, and then she joins up with the VAD and works in England. Mary Vance, however, is all over the book, often much to Rilla's dismay, with her very strong, sharp opinions and know it all attitude. But Mary comes in clutch, not only for the Glen St. Mary community by volunteering to do the hard farm work in the absence of young men, for example, but also for Rilla and Jim's one fateful night when she saves him from the croup. So we can't really choose between these two young women because they're both full of bold initiative and conviction and really shine in their two very different ways in this novel.
And for our quote of the episode, we chose a passage from Rilla's diary where she discusses Faith Meredith working for the VAD. And that's, for the listeners who may not be aware, that's a voluntary aid detachment. And it was a civilian nursing group that provided invaluable support to England and France in World War I. This quote is a very interesting look into the spectrum of service that young women like Rilla and Faith and Mary were able to do during World War I. Quote, "There was a letter from Faith, too. She's doing VAD work in England and writes hopefully and brightly. I think she is almost happy. She saw Jem on his last leave, and she is so near him she could go to him if he were wounded. That means so much to her. Ah, if only I were with her. But my work is here at home. I know Walter wouldn't have wanted me to leave Mother, and in everything I try to keep faith with him, even to the little details of daily life. Walter died for Canada. I must live for her. That's what he asked me to do." And we really like this quote because while we can see that Rilla is proud of Faith's spirit and her heroics, Rilla also values her own more quotidian efforts. She knows that staying home and supporting her family and community is also a valuable service in its own right, even if it sort of lacks the jet-setting glamour of Faith's work.
An interesting contrast and an interesting choice. So, if I can start with Faith Meredith first,
Yeah.
I find it fascinating that Montgomery had Faith doing one of the most romanticized jobs in the First World War for women, and that is a voluntary nurse. To keep the record straight, Canadian war hospitals did not have untrained nurses work on the wards. They only accepted trained graduate nurses. VADs, such as Faith, would have had to take a course probably with the St. John's Ambulance or possibly with the Red Cross. And they would then start working, usually in England, it would be in British war hospitals or convalescent homes, because they relied heavily on VADs to do the voluntary nursing work. Faith wouldn't have started nursing immediately because she wouldn't have known enough.
Mm.
So she was probably set to doing jobs like cleaning the wards, doing dishes, and so on and so forth. And then as she learned more by working on the wards themselves and being trained by the trained nurses who worked there, then she would have undertaken patient care. Some of the VADs who worked throughout the entire war, such as Vera Brittain, author of the Autobiographical Testament of Youth, undertook very complex wound dressings and taking care of ill soldiers. We never have a description of exactly what Faith does, probably because Montgomery wrote only about what she knew. And that's part of the reason that Rilla rings so true with Canadians of the time. But when she was in the hospital, Faith would have encountered severely wounded soldiers. I mean, they were usually held in France until they were stabilized, but not always. At certain times when the fighting was fierce, soldiers were taken directly from the battlefields, put on an ambulance train, then on the ship, and then they would arrive in England. Faith would have encountered these severely wounded men, also ill men. She would have had to help care for them. And I think this is an interesting insight into Faith. It's not mentioned in the book, but she's the one who does go overseas. And we can understand from the quote that you included why she does. She's the one who wished she were a man to go to. She has shown in books like Rainbow Valley, she's the one who goes off and tackles Norman Douglas, stands up in front of the congregation to apologize for her actions and absolve her father. By working in the hospitals, probably in London, though it's never specified, she would learn in much more depth what Jem was undergoing because she would see the men coming back from the battlefield. She would hear their stories. It's not that the women in Canada weren't aware of what war was like. There was not that gap. And Montgomery shows that women were equally aware of what was happening on the battlefronts. But Faith would encounter the bodies of the disabled, the wounded, the ill soldiers when they were not yet sufficiently healed to go back to the battlefield or to go to Canada. So in that sense, she is most certainly Jem's equal. This was considered some of the most valuable work that women could contribute to the war. Mary Vance, on the other hand, is equally, how do we put it, an equally strong character, almost strident, shows no sensitivity towards Rilla's little ongoing romance, and yet at the same time, she does save Jem's life. The war work that she does is interesting because she's doing the less womanly tasks. Of course, she does the knitting and the sewing and so on and so forth, but she goes out and she works in the fields and she gets to wear overalls to do it. I find it an interesting juxtaposition that she tells Rilla about Millard Douglas's wound and his amputated leg. And then she turns immediately to the delight she takes in shocking Kitty Alec by wearing overalls.
Love it. Mary Vance cracks me up as a character because in some ways she is so unlikable, but she is always a force. I remember where in this book, after being opposed to Miller going to war for several, at least a year or two, she sends him off to war. All of a sudden, she's the bravest patriot. And then when Walter leaves shortly thereafter, she's out there on the train station advising the Blythes all about how they should behave when they send someone to war, as if they hadn't already gone through that with Jem. But she's all like, oh, the men like this, and you got to be like this, and don't. And it cracks me up. Like she's only gone through it like a week ago, but now all of a sudden she's the expert. But she's a lady who gets stuff done.
Yeah, she can be very irritating at moments, such as that when they are sending another one of their boys off to war. And there's Mary advising them like she is the most knowledgeable person in the village. Mary, however, is a complex character in the sense of Montgomery wrote in multiple perspectives about the war. And Mary Vance is one of those characters who doesn't immediately enthusiastically embrace war and that
Right.
Canada must enter it. That seems to be a very different perspective from, for example, Jem and Jerry going off to
Mhm.
war enthusiastically. And I find it interesting because, of course, not all Canadians wanted the war, especially in Quebec and especially in parts of the West, because it was an empire war. It was a European war. And they really didn't see why Canada should go and fight for Britain. So, Mary's view, I do like that arc and that trajectory. She begins as not understanding why it's necessary to fight the war. And then when the Lusitania is sunk in 1915, that's her breaking point. And that's when she decides that the atrocities perpetuated on those poor people on the ship, that is too much because it was a civilian ship. It was not supposed to be carrying munitions, and many people died because it sank in 20 minutes. Now, the general public would have known that when Montgomery published the book, so they would have understood Mary's outrage. And this is when, and I do find it interesting once again, it's Mary who decides that Miller's going to war, not necessarily Miller.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. Actually, I was thinking a little bit about what you just said with, right? Like Mary is this contrast to Jem and Faith and Jerry who are on board, but also her ambivalence is very different from Walter's ambivalence.
Right.
Walter is struggling on this level of he's not questioning whether or not he should go to war. He's questioning his feelings of cowardice and the shame that he is wrestling with around not wanting to go to war, but he's not wrestling with whether or not he should go to war, whether or not it's the right thing to do. So while he wrestles with enlisting, it's not the same turn that Mary takes, right? The Lusitania, I think, is a pivotal point for Walter too, in terms, but that's much more about, I think, his feeling like that is more important than his own fear, that the Lusitania sort of highlights that his fear is not big enough in the big scheme of things, a big enough reason to not enlist. Whereas for Mary, it's kind of the first time it seems like where she engages with the war as this idea of whether or not Miller should fight at all. So it's kind of interesting that everybody they're both wrestling with the war, but in very different ways.
Yes, Walter is again interesting because Montgomery complicates any kind of simple response to the war and to the men and women who were involved in it. So Walter has a much more realistic idea about what war and individual fighting consists of. Much better idea than Jem and Jerry. And that is part of what is holding him back is the horror of killing that they never seem to consider when they leave. So Walter, he does not necessarily seem to be only afraid of being wounded or blinded. He is also afraid of the killing itself and the horror of having to kill another man.
Yeah.
Mary doesn't engage at all. You're right, until the Lusitania.
As we're talking about Walter, it makes me think a little bit about that moment in Rainbow Valley when Walter and Faith are having a discussion about, at this point, it's about Walter getting his tooth pulled. And they're having that discussion about pain and blood. And Walter saying seeing somebody in pain makes him want to run far, far away. And Faith says it makes her want to jump in and help. That's such an important exchange because you can see that they carry that right through to the way that they respond in Rilla of Ingleside.
Absolutely. The other thing I thought about Faith and Mary, by the way, there's a class issue here because
Yes.
Faith is the one who goes off to be a VAD, an untrained nurse, And that, of course, in Canada and Britain really was going overseas to be a voluntary nurse. That really was a prestigious position. As it was, by the way, for the thousands of young women in Britain who, as untrained nurses as well. Mary Vance, as we know, is an orphan who
Mhm.
Miss Cornelia has brought up. And of course, she doesn't speak as well as the others grammatically, but she's also assigned the work of being in the fields along with Susan Baker. Whereas Faith has the prestigious job of nursing over in England, Rilla doesn't go into the fields. She goes into a store, and then it's left to Mary and Susan. So I definitely think that Montgomery has a bit of a classed idea about working in the fields, keeping in mind that in Canada, women generally did not do that work. Although when the war came and the shortage of men to help get the harvest in, everyone joined in to help. So women, schoolboys, you name it. But it's still Mary and Susan out there with the pitchforks. Anne's still in the house, Rilla's in the store.
Mary and Susan out there with the pitchforks. Mary's in overalls. Susan's skirts are hitched up, right? You really do see that class difference even in sort of the visual storytelling. Um, right? Rilla's safely behind a storefront, as you say. Anne is at home. These two women are outside the home. They're outdoors under the sun. Sort of intersection here of class and what work was available or expected of the women at this time is I think it's not overtly explained because Maud's contemporary readers would have intuitively understood it. But for us, looking back 100 years later, it is so interesting to think. I'm like, is there a reason that Anne can't work in the fields? Right? She's younger than Susan, right? She's in good health. The reason is class, right?
And Anne and the Blythe girls have a level of privilege and education that leads to them taking leadership roles among their
Right.
peers, among the other women in the community, versus Mary Vance or Susan Baker, right, who are doing this more direct physical work instead of leading. Not that they couldn't. I mean, honestly, you could put Susan Baker out there leading a charge. I'd follow her. She knows what she was doing.
Her
Um,
victory loan speech.
Yes, exactly, right? She gets out there, she gets to do some leadership too. Let's talk actually a little bit about what the college girls were doing. So Nan and Di, and then Faith before she joins the VAD at the start of the war, they are all off at Redmond and working with the Red Cross there. And it seems like that's the first thing that all of the women did, Red Cross in some way, right? Anne and Miss Cornelia immediately are forming a Red Cross group. Obviously, Rilla is forming the Junior Reds, and then Nan and Di are off at Redmond, also working with the Red Cross group. So, why was Red Cross work so common for women during World War One?
So Red Cross work exploded during the war, and the Red Cross's mandate was to help wounded and ill soldiers in hospital and also prisoners of war. So if, as Rilla is at the beginning of the book, you are trying to figure out what can I do to help, the Red Cross was known, it was credible, and it was also very easy to form local chapters who could start work immediately on hospital supplies, such as those sheets that they're basting right at the beginning of the book. However, by the end of the war, the term Red Cross work was used to cover a myriad of activities that weren't necessarily directly related to the Red Cross.
Hmm.
But across Canada, local Red Cross chapters did start up. Before I start in on Nan and Di at college and what they might have been doing, for someone such as Ella Montgomery herself, who was living in Leasdale, Ontario at the war's beginning, her community immediately started up a Red Cross chapter, and she was its president.
Oh, very interesting. So she kind of had the role in Leaguesdale that Anne has here in Glen St. Mary, that like Anne and Miss Cornelia have with their local Red Cross chapter.
Exactly. Now, the local chapters would probably send their goods either to the provincial association And Anne was associated with that because she goes to a Red Cross convention in Charlottetown, or
Mm.
send them to the National Association. And what the provincial and national associations did was to sort the goods. They would pack it for shipment overseas, and it would be distributed to overseas hospitals, some of it to the eventual hospitals in Canada, but overseas hospital in places like France, Gallipoli, because Canadian hospitals were established on Lemnos in the Greek islands to serve the soldiers of Gallipoli, and Salonika, which was also in Greece. So it began with those local women. The Red Cross, a very short time after the war started, distributed knitting and sewing patterns for socks, for example, for sheets, for bandages for the hospitals, for comfort bags for the patients in hospital. So little bags that even young girls could sew, and then they would fill them with, say, a game, a pen, a pad of paper, toothbrush, comb, etc., etc. They also did things like Christmas stockings once a year at Christmas. So a myriad of things. Pajamas, I mean, you name it, pajamas, bed jackets, the aforesaid sheets, all kinds of goods were sewn or manufactured by the women in these local groups. But they also had to raise money because, of course, money is the most flexible commodity. So the local women would, just like Rilla, they would fundraise through concerts, they would have bazaars, they would hold bake sales, they canvassed for goods and supplies and for money. And they did all this for 4.5 years.
Wow.
The Canadian Red Cross raised millions upon millions of dollars that went to fund ambulances. Actual hospitals were built, hospitals and convalescent homes in England, and rest homes for nurses and soldiers in France. They also funded a myriad of goods for hospitals, also for parcels for prisoners of war in Germany, as Jem was. Those were lifesavers for many of those men. So they had a wide range of activities, and it expanded as the war went on. So you can imagine that Ella Montgomery was doing exactly this kind of work. Nan and Di at the university, remember they were in Kingsport, which is Halifax, really, in real life. So it's a major harbor and port. Soldiers leaving for England would embark on ships in Halifax, and soldiers who were disabled or needed additional treatment in hospital would arrive in Halifax. And of course, this would be the destination for many of the troop trains coming from all points of Canada. There were training camps near Halifax. There were all these soldiers coming back and forth on trains and ships. A special effort would have been needed here. Nana Dye's work, although Montgomery never tells us what it was, she does say something about a training camp being there. I can imagine what probably happened. The contributions they would make to that training camp were probably in the way of perhaps a canteen for the men so that they could get inexpensive meals, they could buy cigarettes, they could buy sweets, possibly also recreation rooms, which would have been funded by the Red Cross, by the way, so that soldiers could have the materials to write home. They could play games instead of going to local bars, and they would have pleasant young women, checking the games in and out, making sure they had whatever they needed. It's also a case, though, that Halifax, seeing this number of soldiers going back and forth, the Red Cross did provide a welcome to soldiers who were returning to Canada. And probably also people were needed to guide soldiers from the trains and also provide them with coffee, maybe sandwiches, something along those lines when they arrived in the city.
So almost like a hospitality element, which
Yes,
does start to seem like it's far afield from what you'd think of as the Red Cross doing. But what I'm noticing as you're sort of explaining this is that it really was like looking around and seeing what needed to be done and then just doing it.
absolutely. And it's also a case that even though the young women were at college, it's also a case that many of the colleges, because there were no men at the colleges. So you would
Yeah.
have women's residences or the women in boarding houses. Many of the universities turned part of their residences or even part of their buildings into hospitals or convalescent homes because large spaces were needed, thus providing more opportunity for young women such as Nan, Di, and Faith to actually perform hospital related tasks. So there were many different things they could have been doing. One other thing that springs to mind is because Halifax was a port, many of the Red Cross goods from the Atlantic provinces would have made their way to Halifax. Packing even a single parcel took a great deal of work. Elizabeth de Blois on Prince Edward Island showed us what went into packing a parcel securely to send overseas. Even an individual parcel took a great deal of work. We can also imagine that Red Cross headquarters in Halifax or Kingsport would have received all these goods, which then had to be sorted, repackaged, shipped overseas.
Mm-hmm.
So taking in goods, sorting them, finding out where need was greatest, and then repacking them would be another way of helping.
The scale of this work is so remarkable to me. And it's amazing how, as you're explaining it, Andrea, I can actually see that scale developed in Rilla of Ingleside, whether it is Rilla and her sisters sitting in the living room at Ingleside sewing sheets, and then thinking about how those sheets then get collected at the community level, get collected at the provincial level, and then are collected at a port city like Halifax, Kingsport, and shipped off to the war, where somehow they get everywhere, apparently, to Gallipoli, even to prisoner of war camps. I mean, this is incredible to think, and amazing to think that this was the work of women.
Yes, and
This is what they were doing. This was their service.
it was. They were the fundraisers. They were the ones who organized the bazaars and the bake sales and the concerts. They were the ones who canvassed individuals for money. And there is an entry in Montgomery's diary, and this is what I mean about Red Cross work. It wasn't necessarily for the organization of the Red Cross. There is an entry in Montgomery's diary where they're sewing up packages for the local soldiers for Christmas. And that is a time-consuming effort. They were doing it in the basement of the church at Leasdale. So she fully participated in all of these things. It was time-consuming. I would also add, too, that Red Cross work, the typical work of knitting, for example, or sewing, that could go on almost anywhere. You could be on a train and you could be knitting away. You could be sitting in a lecture and you could be knitting away.
Well, you can see that in Rilla of Ingleside, that they
Yeah.
all talk about, like, when they get bad news, they have a moment to despair and then they pick up their knitting needles again. They are never not knitting or sewing for the war, the women. Anytime you see them sitting together or talking, somebody is knitting, somebody is sewing. It just seems like that's pretty constant.
Yeah, except for Susan on a Sunday.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
ladies got to have her limits.
Exactly. So, despite all this individual effort, wherever you are in the portable nature of the work, most local Red Cross chapters did get together at least once a week for a formal sewing session. And
Mm,
this was part of the community support group for women,
yes.
was simply getting together, socializing, as we see those in the living room at Ingleside doing, even when there's not a formal meeting on. But this was a means of support. Keep in mind, Montgomery lived herself in a rural area. The village of Leasdale was very small. This would be rural women's opportunity to leave the isolation of the farm, to come in once a week and get support from other women. Now, Sarah Glassford, by the way, is the scholar who mentioned this, and the way that Montgomery draws women together in these ways, in some cases to forward the plot. But we can see such meetings and this kind of work for all the women involved, really as community building that focuses on women.
Okay, so can you weigh in on Rilla's debate with her other junior Red Cross members about whether or not there should be snacks at a Red Cross meeting? Because that she was very determined that they not have snacks. And I think you can't have community building without snacks.
Okay, so Montgomery doesn't write in Rilla's concern about why they should not have snacks, but let's keep in mind that at the time, there really weren't any convenience foods except maybe canned salmon.
Oh, yeah.
So if you were going to have snacks, well, it was probably more than snacks when Rilla talks about eats.
Hmm.
So there probably would have been cake or some kind of dessert involved, probably biscuits. You can see what's going to happen. They would hold their meeting, and then there would be rivalry because they were taking turns at holding the meetings in one
Mm.
another's homes. There
Who's
would be
hosting the
rivalry.
best?
Yeah, not only who is the best hostess, but at this particular time, people were supposed to be trying to economize.
Sure.
Now, it might not have mattered so much in 1914 before food rationing started. Rilla seems to have wanted to keep the meetings very businesslike, although they would have also socialized. But there would be that element of there is this luxury of food at the meetings.
Right.
I think they could have compromised. I mean, if you're going to meet for an afternoon and do work, you could have negotiated the level of refreshments served and kept it to something like tea, because that would have been the common beverage, tea in the winter, and possibly, I don't know, crackers, biscuits,
Right.
something
Something
like
more
that.
simple. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess if you're spending time making food for these meetings, you're not spending that time sewing. You can't just like pop open a bag of tortilla chips and a jar of salsa, right? That you can do now, right?
Exactly. And the levels of, keep in mind the social expectations of the time, completely serious about company for tea, three kinds of cake on the table. One would have been fruit cake, the second pound cake, but the third had to be fresh cake. So I have to add there that possibly part of the reason that Montgomery had Rilla say no eats and have a pitched battle over it is because Montgomery, as a minister's wife, knew how much work went into holding such meetings in her home or contributing to gatherings.
Right. So she's going to let Rilla spare herself that particular headache for negotiating who is making what and when.
Or
Yes,
refocusing that energy on the work that they need to do, refocusing their energy not on preparing food, but preparing all of the fabric work they were doing.
yes, you have to admit, though, that Montgomery does give us hints of everyone not getting along, and there is a little bit of competition in there, especially when Rilla makes a comment about her knitting bag that it's going to be the handsomest one in the society.
Right. Because again, you're still human, even in the middle of the war, and a
Exactly.
little vanity and a little pride and a little like competition with, again, she's 15, right?
Yeah.
You can kind of see that in there, but also that's a very human thing.
I think the least interesting characters are saints, really.
Right.
Montgomery's characters are always more complex and always have these touches that mark them as human and 15 and suddenly thrust into this new situation.
Right. I think there's a reason why this book is not from Una's perspective.
Oh, yes, definitely.
We are going to pause right here because we still have so much more of our discussion with Andrea that we want to share with you. And we will do that in a part 2. So we just couldn't bear to cut anything to get this episode down to anywhere close to an hour.
No, I can't edit that well. It would be too sad to leave some of this on the cutting room floor. So, part 2 it is. But we are so grateful for everyone who has been listening and sharing the podcast. Please feel free to drop us a line either on our Instagram or email us at kindredspirits.bookclub@gmail.com. We really love hearing from you. If you haven't yet, please rate us 5 stars wherever you listen. It helps more Anne fans find our cozy little corner of the internet. And if you email us about your review, we will send you a sticker and a thank you note. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope you will join us in 2 weeks for the conclusion to our discussion with Andrea on our next episode of Kindred Spirits Book Club. Thanks, Kindred Spirits.
Thank you. Bye.